Well, here we are again today with the Acharya's Copyrights, Reflections on Irresponsible Publishing, the Hidden History of the BBT, and these are discourses offered by Gupta Dasa. Thank you so much again for doing this, and I'm looking forward to more education.
Well, thank you, Garuda, for hosting. I'm ready to go.
You're ready to go. Good. Well, so what we've got today then is the topic that I'm going to share with on my screen. Today's topic is the Acharya's Matchless Gift, and this is the third discourse. And before we start that, let me do this.
This presentation does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create an attorney-client relationship. It is offered for general informational purposes only. This presentation constitutes a fair use of any copyrighted materials pursuant to Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, Fair Use Exemption, and any other provision of U.S. copyright law which may apply. Copyright 2022 Tiger Pace, LLC, all rights reserved.
Okay, well, Gupta ji, you came up with this title for today's discourse, the Acharya's Matchless Gift. Perhaps we can start with that. Say what you mean by that.
That title, the Acharya's Matchless Gift, is significant. It refers to the author, the Acharya's literary works. And his literary works are really his instructional presence. They're his Vani. So his matchless gift is really his realization-infused expressions through books. And the reason this is important is because there's a legal dimension associated with this topic. And in order to be able to discuss that part of it, I would like to take a moment now to ask you to, if you would please share your viewpoint on a question I have for you. Which is, in view of the Acharya's instructions and directives for his books, and you're very much aware of those, are there any legitimate academic, devotional, scholastic reasons why or which would allow for posthumous editing?
Okay. Well, you know, I have, over the course of the last 4 years, consulted with at least more than 24 academics who do work in various fields of translation and preservation of deceased authors' works. And the consensus is, and I'm not saying majority, I'm saying the consensus is that you simply don't change what an author leaves unless the author leaves instructions or particulars for, posthumous work on his or her work. I have a colleague who works on Russian literature, and she works with many older authors who have passed away. And I told her what was going on with Prabhupada's works. And she looked at me and she said, that's unthinkable. It's unthinkable. You can't, what if I went away for 2 months, Gupta ji, and you came to my house and you renovated it? I didn't ask you to renovate it. You just come to my house and you renovate it. It's preposterous. The real issue is then, how do you preserve the Acharya's works, without changing the Acharya's works? In fact, changing it is really not preserving, is it? So even when Prabhupada was here, Prabhupada gave these instructions, and I'll share my screen. In a letter that Prabhupada wrote to Rupanuga Prabhu in 1970, he made it very clear this is too small, the writing, so I'll blow it up here a little bit, and it's even perhaps a little hard to read here, but essentially this is what it says. Our editing is to correct grammatical and spelling errors only, without interpolation of style or philosophy. So this was what Prabhupada requested while he was here, what to speak of when he's not physically here. And what has happened is that the editors at BBT have been working with assumptions that I think are preposterous. And I've listed those assumptions here. If I may I read them? What sort of a sketch of the assumptions that I feel that they've made?
Excellent.
Here they are. Prabhupada didn't know how bad his editors were. So in other words, Prabhupada was ignorant about the editors with whom he was working. Do we really think that's true? Prabhupada was unaware of the mistakes in his books. Prabhupada, even in my limited experience, is one of the most aware persons I've ever met in my life. Prabhupada trusted his editors when he should not have. So this is basically saying Prabhupada misjudged. Prabhupada was just too busy to care about his books. Honestly, Gupta ji, I think Prabhupada cared about his books more than anything else, invoking his own spiritual master's desire to print books rather than build temples, sell the marble if we have to. Prabhupada didn't have time to be concerned with his books. Oh, okay, so Prabhupada was not terribly competent at building his movement? These are preposterous assumptions, Gupta ji, but this is what they were working with. In so many words, this is what they're saying by their editing. Prabhupada was unable to empower his early editors. Is that right? I think not. Prabhupada's English was poor and needs rewriting. Well, if Prabhupada felt that way, then he would ask someone like Hayagriva, who was an English professor, to smooth out his writing. If that's what he wanted, he authorized Hayagriva to do so. Prabhupada would want us to go to earlier drafts to correct his books and make them better. Now, this is really a transgression. This is tantamount to trespassing on an author's work. There is no way that any author would want his or her earlier drafts consulted after the author has passed away and then redone, the books redone according to earlier drafts. I mean, honestly, Gupta ji, I'm an author. And, if you took, after I would leave this world, if you took my earlier drafts of books and redid my books according to a second edition, this would be preposterous. And then finally, this is really maybe the worst one. Prabhupada's works are essentially unfinished until a BBT editor completes them. To me, this is hubris. Prabhupada's books need to be preserved for all posterity. Vani is the way that Prabhupada said he will still be with us, he will still teach us, he will still speak to us. And yet, the BBT editors literally go in and make changes ad hoc when they feel like it, when they think it might be better, when they think it's said in a better way. Mm-hmm. It's preposterous. So, no changes, no mistakes is the ultimate editorial policy, but how to execute that is a subject for another time. So I turn it over to you, Gupta ji. Does this answer some of your, is this a good enough response, or do you need more?
Well, this is fine. I think what we're looking for is that it's clear that there has been unauthorized editing of the
Yeah.
of the Acharya's works. And my research into the IPR, which is based on publicly available documentation, was done in response to this unauthorized posthumous editing. So there's a tie here, and I didn't know of that tie in the same way as I do now, because it took looking at the IPR record, the intellectual property right, IPR record. There's a mashup, clearly, of the editing issues, and they're hand in glove, basically, to the IPR record as well. The irresponsible publishing resulted from unauthorized posthumous editing. Wouldn't you agree with that? Basically, that's why we say there's irresponsible publishing, is because
Yes.
of unauthorized posthumous editing.
Yes, indeed. And on a theological, devotional level, it becomes even more preposterous, especially when you read something like the following. This is from a room conversation with Bhagavad Dasa in Mumbai, 1974. Every day you have to read my books. Do you know that every day even I read my books, my own books? Do you know why I read my books? I read my books every day because even I learn something new when I read them. Do you know why I learn something new when I read my books? Because these books are not my books. I do not write these books. Every morning when I sit here to write my books, Krishna comes personally and he dictates to me what to write. I simply take dictation from Krishna and I write these books. Therefore, when I read them, even I learn something. Now, from this, Guptaji, the BBT, I just don't know how those assumptions can stand if BBT editors, who are disciples of Prabhupada, but how they can sustain those assumptions when Prabhupada makes this kind of assertion. If Krishna is writing these books through Prabhupada, then the utmost respect and the most sensitive preservation should be taking place, and it has not. I don't know what more to say except that these words are not taken seriously.
Exactly. And so, again, the irresponsible publishing resulted from the unauthorized posthumous editing, as you're clearly explaining and showing. And once the IPR research got underway, it became obvious, and now it's very, very well documented, that there was an irresponsible stewardship over the author's IPR.
Yeah.
Just like there's irresponsible publishing, there's an irresponsible stewardship or preservation and protection of the author's IPR during his manifest presence as well as after. And just as the irresponsible editing is a result of unauthorized editing, the result of this irresponsible stewardship was manifested in unauthorized action and legally problematic decisions by the ISKCON publisher. So that's why I call this a hand in glove. And that conclusion was not easily reached, and it was not early reached. It took a lot of data, a lot of information to go through in order to determine whether what exactly were the problems with the IPR and where did they stem from? Why did they happen? So it's kind of like a murder mystery where you just continue to unravel different layers of what's going on in order to get a picture. But
let me just interrupt you quickly, and just for our viewers, IPR stands for intellectual property rights. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, okay. We use those abbreviations too quickly sometimes. Okay, good.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, there's a very interesting difference here, which is why we're talking actually, why we're having these videos, is because in order to write the course, in order to get back on course with the editing issues, consistent with the Acharya's directives, it depends on the cooperation of the apparent copyright owner. In legal terms, we call that the putative or apparent owner of the copyrights. That's been the difficulty. That's been kind of the block, is that the cooperation is practically non-existent. It's running out the clock, putting roadblocks in the way, and not moving forward.
Hmm.
On the other hand, the writing the course in relationship to the IPR does not take cooperation with the owner. That's a really big difference. In other words, that can be the effect of the legal results associated with all of this research, is that at this point, without that cooperation, it has to go to another place. And ultimately, where does it go if it can't be decided in-house? It has to be looked at by those who have say over what can legally be done and what legally cannot be done. So these are what I consider jarring, irreconcilable editing issues, and I consider, after all this research into the IPR, it is a jarring and irreconcilable copyright issues associated with the books. Some of those issues I'm going to just mention. Feel free to jump in if the language needs a little clarification.
Translation. Yeah.
A translation, thank you.
Yeah.
There is a long list of conclusions. Now, we're not talking about the details of it, just the conclusions, but certainly having numerous names in registrations and copyright notices is a problem. If there's some rhyme or reason for it, or there's a proper transfer in some way that allows that to happen, that's fine, but that's not actually the case. Moreover, the copyright notices themselves, because of their the need to comport with the 1909 Copyright Act, are also in bad shape, so to speak. They're problematic. In addition, and we'll cover all of these issues in later videos in depth, but again, in conclusion, there are multiple trusts involved in the copyright history. We have a trust, we have a March 30th, 1972 trust from India. We have a May 29th trust from California. We have a trust from Europe. We have a trust from a number of other countries, and they appear in the books as the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust. That's a problem. We'll discuss that.
Why is that a problem? Can you just say briefly? I mean, like, having all of these trusts, why is that problematic?
Because copyright law is based on being able to recognize who the actual owner is.
Okay.
So if you say duck 1, duck 2, duck 3, duck 4, at least we know that there are different ducks. But if you say duck owns it, duck owns it, duck owns it, but they're different ducks, and you don't point that out, you've got a problem.
Okay.
And that's why it's complicated. In addition, U.S. Copyright Office registrations, many of them are inaccurate, many are misleading, and as far as I can determine from the public records, numerous have false information associated with the registrations. That's a big problem, including, I'll wait to get into that aspect a little bit later. Another big area is the assignments. I know that you probably wanted me to discuss that a little bit in terms of what that even means, but basically it's as if most people are aware of how this works in real estate, is that you own a house and you have a title, and then to transfer that house, you have to sign off on your title, or the owner has to sign off on the title to transfer it. So a type of transfer is called an assignment. And in copyright, in the world of intellectual property rights, an assignment obviously has to be signed by the rightful copyright owner. Pre-78, there were 11 assignments filed with the US Copyright Office, 2 of which are for the same book, so it's really having about 10 of them. Of those 10, 3 of them were books still in the Acharya's name, which were transferred by someone else, not by the Acharya, not by his signature. That's a problem. The other 7 books also have problems because, frankly, I'm in the business of doublespeak, I guess you'd say, but those assignments are practically incoherent and would take the cake for ineffective doublespeak. And I understand why that happened. I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but it doesn't change the record.
Okay.
In addition, another area we'll get into is that the charitable trust in California was divested. I don't know that too many people realize, or devotees realize, that it was over 30 years ago, in May 15th of 1990, that the BBT was divested, which means all of the intellectual property rights, the IPR, was transferred to the corporation authorized to be formed by the GBC. And all of those copyrights, all those intellectual property rights are still held by the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust International. After the BBTII was formed, within a few years, another event occurred, which was the filing of almost, I believe it was 69 or 70 works made for hire registrations associated with the books. This is another problem. These are the kind of problems that are similar to the problems that you, Garuda, point out when you look at a particular verse and you look at what was interpolated and you look at how it was changed and you look at needless adjustments. This is exactly reflects that same dynamic. And it's not that surprising because it's basically the same group of devotees. It was basically the BBT with help from others. So there's a few other areas we'll also get into, which I'll just mention, which is the difficulty of copyrights being held by a nonprofit organization, corporation, that in fact not only doesn't have a duty of loyalty in the same way trustees have to the trust race or the trust property, but in a much more difficult way, the trust was set up because the Acharya was very familiar with the strength of what a trust does. A trust sets up a beneficiary who's going to receive the results if anything goes wrong. And in the case of the May 29th, 1972 trust, the beneficiary was to be ISKCON. Corporations, on the other hand, don't have beneficiaries. They can if anything goes south with a corporation, there can be a request within or a statement that the property should go in a certain direction, but that's not the case at this point. Hopefully that will be sorted out quickly, but as far as I know, that's been lingering for many years. If that provision is not there, then any judge who has control over that legal situation can transfer the property to any qualified nonprofit. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be associated with ISKCON. These are huge, huge issues. They're as huge and dominating as the editing issues are to Prabhupada's Adivani. They're hand in glove. They're the same. They're the same. So I would like to tie this together a little bit more. because the question then really arises: how did it happen? It's many problems occurred beginning in 72, but there are many problems were already existing between 66 and 72. Again, this is an overview. We'll get into the details of this in other in the following videos that we discuss the details of these particular points. But let's just think about this for a second, because when the first books were being printed, and including the books by that being professionally printed in the U.S., the Bhagavad Gita by Macmillan, the Acharya Prabhupada, the author, was not involved with the books in the way that he was pre-66. And pre-66, Prabhupada was basically doing most of everything. So how the book looked and what information you put in there, he was very familiar with. And of course, that was done under the Berne Convention, as we've discussed in the last video. Under the Berne Convention, there were no formalities required. On the other hand, post-65, for the author, there were tremendous involved, very confusing formalities, which, as far as I know, the Acharya, this author, really turned over his stewardship for that part of it to his disciples, to handle those technical legal aspects. And then the rest is history. So who did he turn them over to? He turned them over to aspiring disciples who were dedicated to Krishna consciousness. At the same time, they were relatively young, inexperienced adults. They were trying to fix most of the times we're trying to fix some sort of a problem associated with the book in order to increase the distribution. And there's little to no. I don't actually know of any actual training in IPR or experience in IPR, which would have given anyone really who is involved with the books, even through most a good portion of the 70s, from actually knowing what to do. And so we have this dichotomy here. We have a very, a pure desire to do good, to do the right thing, to influence society in a positive way, in a spiritual way. And then on the other hand, we have an inexperienced crowd who is not familiar with IPR, certainly did not study the 1909 Act. And if they did, they could spend a lot of time trying to figure it out, especially in that time when there weren't that much even reference materials that discussed that. They'd have to look through cases, which is a very complicated process. So that's kind of pretty much the best defense there is, and that defense is not recognized by the courts. The courts say basically it doesn't recognize what the courts say: an empty head and a pure heart is not a legal defense. So an empty head means basically I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm still going to do it. And a pure heart is, well, but I had good intentions. Yeah. And so there's not a whole lot of equitable avenues to pursue under the present copyright record. So what is the conclusion of this is really that the unauthorized book changes and the problematic IPR history, they're connected, they're intertwined, and they're intertwined not just in the cause and the devotees who are involved in it, which is also a factor, but they're also intertwined to the extent that the only solution, apparently at this point, to the unauthorized editing has a legal component to it now. And that legal component, in my view, needs to be a choice by the devotee community. Clearly, the stewardship over the IPR is really not the best source after all of these years of what has happened in the IPR record, to now step up and say, well, we should decide that. Really, the devotee community should decide that. This is a very awkward situation because Prabhupada wanted it to go a certain way, but without question, it did not go that way.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Gupta ji, this is really amazing. I can't wait to get into more of the particulars as you're promising to do. And just to wind up things here, I have to say that when I first looked into this 4 years ago, this whole problem of the editing, so-called editing, it's gotten the sort of popular name book changes along the way. I didn't know what was going on. I was about to look into it 4 years ago after so many devotees had approached me. And these were very sincere, seasoned devotees, very intelligent devotees. These were not extremists. These were not ISKCON haters. And I just felt compelled by their insistence that I was the one to look into this. But one thing that's coming up for me right now is I'm reflecting back on those days when I could tell that devotees' hearts were sensing that something was really wrong. They couldn't put their finger on it scholastically or academically or textually, and they couldn't put their finger on it in terms of legally, or corporately or whatever. But devotees' hearts are so sensitive and they're so loyal to Prabhupada, they can feel intuitively something is wrong.
It's been wrong for a long, long time. It really has.
It's been wrong for a long, long time. And devotees have, on their own time, spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours showing comparisons, but not quite knowing how to articulate it academically, what to speak of, how to articulate it legally. And so what I'm really appreciating in your presentation is how there are these parallels, because I don't know how to articulate it legally. So this is wonderful. I appreciate so much today's presentation.
Well, that's great. Before we do go, it just take about 2 minutes. I would like to answer a question. I get questions from devotees on constantly or regularly, I should say, on some of these issues. And I'd say I want to discuss the response to, now that we're here, to one question that's, I'd say, majority of the questions revolve around the issue of weren't most of these issues already addressed in the 1997, 1998 litigation, which was the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust International, Inc., the BBT II, against Hans Carey, who is, of course, Hansaduta Prabhu, who was a former BBT trustee. Wasn't this stuff straightened out already? Wasn't it decided? Yeah. And there are three points here that I can make quickly. Is that, first of all, that case was not about was litigation over the existence of a trust, or should say the existence of the BBT as a trust. That was the litigation. It came from a Singapore case, which could not go any place because of some issues that came up, and so it was transferred to California, and it's over the existence of the BBT as a trust. And Hansaduta as a trustee. Okay. The second point is that it was never, and it was not, and it can't be, it could never be an IPR or a copyright case. It couldn't be, because it was in California state court. State court doesn't have jurisdiction over the federal system involving copyrights. Right. So copyrights are heard in federal court because federal courts have exclusive subject matter jurisdiction, which means they're exclusively the arbiter of anything to do with this subject matter, IPR, under their system. So it was never addressed. Now, it doesn't mean that it wasn't discussed by the plaintiff, BBTII, which was, I believe, trying to set a stage that really didn't matter in one sense to the case, but that's what they were doing.
Hmm.
And then the third point is that during that case and at the end, in order to move that case a little further toward and a little quicker towards settlement, I had retained an IPR firm to look at a couple of the books on a very, on a limited basis, although it was fairly expensive to have that done and have those books evaluated. And that material, those conclusions were presented to the BBTII, and somewhat, very short time after the case did settle, on terms that I don't know if I can, not really sure if it's been freed up that I can discuss them, but I can say certainly they were on terms that were beneficial to the defendants and the cross complainants who I represented in the case. So that's the answer to that question. If anybody can think of something else, that I'd be happy to answer it in the next video.
Excellent. Superb. Thank you so much, Gupta ji. I look forward to even more education on this matter, and I see I'm beginning to learn about the glove and the hand working together here. So I look forward to more enlightening discussions with you.
And
thank you so much.
And I thank you for hosting it, and for the audience for listening. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Yes, and I too appreciate our audience. Thank you. Hare Krishna.